In this episode of Trekking Through Compliance, we take up the episode Dagger of the Mind.
Compliance, the final frontier. Tom Fox is the voyager of Trekking Through Compliance. His mission? To explore the original series and seek out and share what it can teach you about compliance. Here's your host, Tom Fox.
Episode 9, Dagger of the Mind. In this episode of Trekking Through Compliance, we consider the episode Dagger of the Mind, which aired November 3, 1966, stardate 2515.1. As the Enterprise makes a routine visit to the Tantalus penal colony, transporter technician Berkeley tries to beam supplies down, only to discover that he is prevented from doing so by a security force field. After the colony drops the shield, the colony beams a box of research material up to the Enterprise. However, the box actually contains Simon Van Gelder, former assistant to the penal colony director Tristan Adams. Van Gelder karate chops the transporter technician, then makes his way to the bridge of the Enterprise, and with a phaser he has taken from a security guard, he demands asylum. But Kirk and Spock overpower him. Bones suspects something amiss and wishes to keep Van Gelder on board for examination. Kirk and Dr. Helen Noel, an acquaintance from a Christmas party of past years, hence the name, beam down to investigate. After Kirk and Dr. Noel beam down, Van Gelder tells Spock about Adams' use of a neuron neutralizer to empty the minds of his inmates. He warns that Kirk is in danger and consents to have Spock mind meld with him to discover the truth. Kirk and Dr. Noel observe the neuron neutralizer being applied to patients by Adams' assistant Eli and become suspicious. When Kirk and Dr. Noel secretly examine the neuron neutralizer by having Dr. Noel use it on Kirk at minimum intensity, she suggests that they renew their Christmas party encounter. Adams wrenches control from her and turns the neutralizer to high intensity and forces Kirk to drop his phaser and communicator. Kirk and Dr. Noel are then taken prisoner. Dr. Noel escapes through a ventilation duct, and her escape is reported by Lethay, a cured patient. Kirk is saved from having his mind seriously harmed during a second neuron neutralizer session when Dr. Noel turns off the power to the Tantalus colony, including the energy shield. Dr. Noel is waylaid in the shield room but pushes her attacker into a high-voltage transformer. Kirk then knocks out Dr. Adams and his assistant and goes in search of Dr. Noel. Spock, noticing that the shield is off, beams down and restores power to the colony. Adams, still unconscious in the treatment room, is subjected to the neuron neutralizer and is killed of loneliness when the machine empties his mind despite having it been at low intensity. Van Gelder is left behind to destroy the treatment room and reconstruct the colony. Fun fact from this episode, it was the first episode to have the appearance of the Vulcan mind meld. It was very interesting rewatching this episode in 2022 in preparation for this updated Trekking Through Compliance series, and it really got me thinking about mental health and loneliness, particularly in the context of the pandemic. Many workers were struggling with this issue, and hopefully it has brought to the forefront some of the things that companies can do to help employees, particularly around mental health. One of my colleagues says it's not mental health, it's health, period. And the sooner companies recognize that, frankly, the better off they're going to be, because a healthy employee is obviously a much more productive employee. So think about this episode in the context of your own mental health programs at your organization. You as a CCO really need to make sure your team, whether working remotely, whether working from home, whether working in a hybrid environment, or if you're back in the office, the mental health of your team is still good and robust. Next, we're going to take up the compliance takeaways from this episode. So what are some of the compliance lessons from this episode, Dagger of the Mind? Number 1, human rights and ethical treatment. This episode depicts a penal colony where prisoners are subjected to inhumane treatments and mind-controlled techniques. This scenario highlights the importance of compliance within human rights standards and the ethical treatment of individuals, even in the context of incarceration or detention. Compliance programs should ensure that organizations uphold fundamental human rights and dignity. Number 2, whistleblower protection. In this episode, the crew of the Enterprise encounters a whistleblower who risks their own safety to expose the abuses which were happening at the penal colony. Compliance programs should have robust whistleblower protection policies in place to encourage reporting of wrongdoing, ensure that individuals who come forward are shielded from retaliation. 3, oversight and accountability. This episode reveals a lack of external oversight and accountability at the penal colony, allowing the abusive practices to continue unchecked. Compliance frameworks should emphasize the importance of independent audits, regulatory oversight, and transparent reporting to ensure that organizations maintain appropriate checks and balances and a second set of eyes. Always remember the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg. Number 4, due process and fair trials. The penal colony's disregard for due process and fair trials is a concerning aspect of this episode. In the 2020 evaluation, or rather update to the evaluation of corporate compliance programs, the Department of Justice said that the compliance function is the holder of the flame for institutional justice and institutional fairness in an organization. This means compliance function should uphold the principles of procedural fairness, including the right to a fair and impartial hearing, access to legal representation, and the presumption of innocence. All of this, of course, will lead to the fair process doctrine. Number 5, data privacy and informed consent. The mind control techniques employed at the penal colony raise issues related to data privacy and informed consent. Compliance programs should ensure that organizations respect individual privacy rights and obtain appropriate consent when collecting and storing or using personal information, even in the context of correctional or rehabilitational settings. Number 6, corporate social responsibility. It's a term we really haven't talked too much about in this series or very much in podcasts on the Compliance Podcast Network, at least recently. And this episode's exploration of the penal colony's practices highlight the importance of corporate social responsibility and the need for organizations to consider the broader societal impacts of the operations. Compliance programs should incorporate CSR principles to ensure that organizations act as responsible corporate citizens. By learning from the compliance-related lessons in the Dagger of the Mind, companies can strengthen their human rights protection, whistleblower protections through policies and oversight mechanisms, due process guarantees, data privacy safeguards, and CSR responsibility or CSR initiatives, thereby enhancing their overall compliance posture. I hope you'll join us for our next episode where we take a look at the Corbomite maneuver.
If you enjoyed this episode of Trekking Through Compliance, you can help it grow by sharing it with the biggest Trek fan you know.
This podcast is a part of the C-Suite Radio Network. For more top business podcasts, visit c-suiteradio.com.